The war is not about GDP, but about the structure of GDP. Some people always use GDP data to prove that Russia's GDP is not as good as that of a province in China, or that of a state in the United States. Therefore, the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war must be Russia's defeat. What is GDP? GDP is the economic output value of the three major industries. And the added value of GDP is the added value of the three major industries. Therefore, to understand the true meaning of GDP and its actual role in economic and social development, one must first figure out what the three major industries are. Someone once said vividly that the first industry is raising cattle, the second industry is slaughtering cattle, and the third industry is eating cattle. This is very vivid and can fully explain the essence of the three major industries. Without the primary industry and the secondary industry, the tertiary industry is a castle in the air. No one raises or slaughters cattle, and you can only eat air. In peacetime, of course, people who eat cattle are more powerful than those who raise and slaughter cattle, because people who eat cattle have more money, right? However, in a war situation, the situation is very different. Fighting wars is essentially a fight for consumption, especially the Russo-Ukraine war, which is actually a fight for consumption. Fight whose consumption? Of course, it is the consumption of the battlefield. At this time, it is the battlefield that eats cattle, not rich people, and what is eaten on the battlefield is not only cattle, but also various weapons and equipment. If we want to continue to consume, we must rely on the primary industry and the secondary industry to produce at full capacity. The primary industry produces food, including cattle. The secondary industry produces industrial equipment, including weapons and equipment. Therefore, in a state of war, the tertiary industry is nothing. No matter how high its data in GDP is, it has become useless moisture. With this in mind, let's look at the GDP structure data of several major economies. For the convenience of comparison, we first list the GDP structure data of the top three economies of the United States, China, Japan, and Russia. United States, 2022 GDP of $25.47 trillion. Among them, the primary industry accounts for about 1%, which is about $250 billion US. The secondary industry accounts for 19%. It is about $4.8 trillion US. The tertiary industry accounts for 80%, which is about $20.4 trillion. China, GDP of $18 trillion in 2022. Among them, the primary industry accounted for 7%, about $1.3 trillion US. The secondary industry accounted for about 40%, about $7.2 trillion US. The tertiary industry accounted for about 53%, about $9.5 trillion US. Japan, GDP of $4.23 trillion in 2022. Among them, the primary industry accounts for about 5%, which is about $200 billion US. The secondary industry accounts for about 20%, which is about $850 billion US. The tertiary industry accounts for about 75%, which is about $3.2 trillion US. Russia, GDP of $2.24 trillion in 2022. Among them, the primary industry accounts for about 20%, which is about $450 billion US. The secondary industry accounts for about 70%, which is about $1.5 trillion US. The tertiary industry accounts for about 10%, which is about $200 billion US. The above list is the proportion data of the three major industries in GDP. Let's take a look at the proportion of the most important manufacturing industry in the secondary industry in GDP. The U.S. manufacturing industry accounts for only about 10% of its GDP. And the manufacturing output value in 2022 will be about 2.5 trillion US dollars. Japan's manufacturing industry accounts for about 20% of GDP, and its manufacturing output value will be about 840 billion US dollars in 2022. China's manufacturing industry accounts for about 33% of GDP, and the output value of manufacturing in 2022 is about 5.9 trillion US dollars. Russia's manufacturing industry accounts for about 32% of GDP, and the manufacturing output value in 2022 will be about 720 billion US dollars. There is also a simpler manufacturing data. The manufacturing output value of the United States and the European Union both account for about 15% of the world, and China's manufacturing output value accounts for more than 30% of the world, which is almost the sum of the United States and the European Union. The most closely related to war, besides the primary industry, is the secondary industry, especially the manufacturing industry and the secondary industry. Under the conditions of war, if the moisture of the tertiary industry is excluded, the actual situation of the primary industry and the secondary industry, the total output value of the primary and secondary industries of the above countries is: the United States is about 5.1 trillion US dollars, China is about 8.5 trillion US dollars, Japan is about 1 trillion US dollars, and Russia is about 2 trillion US dollars. Now you should know why Russia dares to fight a war of attrition with the United States, right? If you look at Russia's industrial structure, the primary industry accounts for 20%. With sufficient food and grass, the secondary industry accounts for 70%, and energy and manufacturing are fully guaranteed. The tertiary industry only accounts for 10%, which can be ignored. If you look at the United States again, the tertiary industry accounts for 80%. In a state of war, this 80% is all water, which is of no use. We must always understand that only the primary industry and the secondary industry can truly create real value and realize value appreciation. The so-called tertiary industry can be simply understood as parasites of the first two industries. Some people always say that it is the United States that wants to fight a protracted war of attrition. This is obviously a stupid statement that does not understand the economic structure at all. It is not Russia that really wants to fight a blitzkrieg, but the United States. The United States thinks that by virtue of its own advantages in the tertiary industry, that is, the so-called advantages of the financial services industry, and the hegemony of the US dollar, it can instantly destroy the Russian economy. Before and at the beginning of the war, Biden repeatedly threatened that the United States would collapse the Russian economy instantly. Unfortunately, the exact opposite is true. Not only did the Russian economy not crash, but it got better and better. Russia's economy depends on the primary and secondary industries, not the illusory tertiary industry, not the virtual economy. Only the United States is a typical representative of the virtual economy. In the context of war, the economic structure of the United States is simply dehydrated. As long as the war continues for another year or two, it would be strange if the US economy does not collapse. The EU's tertiary industry also accounts for more than 70%, which is also very empty, almost entirely relying on Germany's manufacturing industry as a pillar and support. Of course, the EU cannot sustain the Russo-Ukrainian war. So we can see that the EU has begun to want to stay away from the war and is trying to get out. Just now, the EU declared that Ukraine's security has nothing to do with the EU. Because the EU is not a security organization, Ukraine's security depends on NATO and certain countries. Interesting. Who are some countries referring to? After reading the above economic structure data, you should understand that if China and Russia really join forces, food, energy, and manufacturing are the real pillars of the three major wars. Who is afraid of whom? I have said many times before that the Russia-Uzbekistan war was a war between currency and that the Sino-US war is essentially a war between currency and currency. The reason is the same, just from different angles.